everything we discover in terms of genetics, all of the stuff that your brother does as a doctor and as a researcher is unified by a theory of a unifying theory of biology, which is based on evolution. None of the
biology is based on evolution. Did I just hear you say that?
Yeah. Evolution is the unifying theory of biology. Yes, you can't explain most of the things about biology without evolution. They are one and the same. They absolutely come from each other.
So much of biology has nothing to do with evolution. Biology is a study of nature and how nature works. And it's a beautiful study. All right? Biology is not based on evolution. Give me a break. Biology is based on observation of life and how life operates. Evolution as an origin has nothing to do with science. Evolution as an origin is a philosophy that behind the process of evolution, there's no intelligent mind, there's just chance and fate. Obviously, I disagree with that philosophy of evolution as an origin. But I've got to be honest enough to acknowledge that even though I accept evolution as a process, there are so many gaps in the fossil record that for me to look this man in the face and say, evolution, that we came from a single cell to today through this mutation, process of mutation, that is so intellectually dishonest.
No,
it's scary. Yes, it is.
It's not intellectually
There's
dishonest.
absolutely
It is
no
far more
proof.
intellectually dishonest to claim a man rose from the dead 2,000 years ago than it is to claim that we evolved from single cells.
No, that's philosophy. It's a philosophical issue of, do you allow for a supernatural God?
No, because the difference
Obviously,
is that
if there's
there is
no
evidence
God,
for one and
dead
no
people don't
evidence for the
rise.
other.
But if there is a supernatural God, the resurrection of Christ is not irrational. No supernatural God, resurrection of Christ is obviously irrational. It's stupid. If there's no supernatural God. But if there is a supernatural God, it's not irrational to believe that a dead Christ rose from the dead.
We just spent some time establishing how important it is to be objective about evidence, and yet, in order for you to make that claim, you have to establish that a supernatural God exists. How do you do that with evidence? How do you do that by being objective and arguing in good faith? You can't.
By pointing
it's
out.
not possible.
All right.
It goes
then
back
fine,
to this
sir.
whole thing that
If you're going to ask a
spinning
question
philosophy.
and then answer it by saying it's impossible, I'm going to go on to somebody else.
All right, go
Because
ahead
you're
and
not being open-minded. You're being so close-minded. You ask a question, and then you say to me it's impossible.
All right, go ahead.
How is that meaningful intellect? Thank you so much. How is that meaningful intellectual discourse?
I've already said you can answer the question.
No, but that's intellect. You've shown your dishonesty.
I
You asked a question, you said it's impossible.
I threw the gauntlet down, and instead of answering the question, you've decided to tell me how wrong I was for answering the question first. How about you answer the question now that I asked you?
You agree not to interrupt me?
I apologize for doing that.
All right,
Go
I
ahead.
forgive you. All right. The reason that I believe God exists is because the evidence points to God's existence. First piece of evidence. Order and design point to a designer. If I were to say that this shirt came about as a result of a hurricane passing through a cotton field, that would be ludicrous. Why? Because the order and the design of the shirt points to a tailor, a designer. I am convinced that she has a rational mind. Why? Have I ever touched her mind? Have I ever smelled her mind? Have I ever seen her brain? No, not once. But the evidence of her articulate speech, the evidence of the way she dresses herself in an orderly fashion, convinces me that between those two beautiful ears, there's a rational mind. Similarly, I cannot see God, I cannot audibly hear God, I cannot touch or smell God. But the order and design of the universe, the order and design of the human body, demand an intelligent mind. So that's the first reason that I believe there is some type of God, some type of designer. Second piece of evidence that God exists, moral absolutes. I am convinced that the abuse of innocent children is never, ever good. I am convinced that objectively, the abuse of an innocent child is absolutely evil. The only way there can be an objective moral is if there is some type of moral lawgiver, some type of mind pre-human mind who creates and defines the value of human dignity, the value of justice. Otherwise, it's all relative. And that's what you have to believe if you're an atheist, that morality is relative. Okay, I am convinced that, yes, much of morality is relative, but there are at least a few moral absolutes, like the abuse of an innocent child is 100% evil. That demands a moral lawgiver. So those are the two top pieces of evidence for me that convince me that indeed there is some type of God. Does that make any sense?
None of it is actually observable, repeatable, or evidence in any manner of the word. I asked you about evidence, and you gave rational argument. We need observable, repeatable, scientific evidence.
Oh.
Going back to how we talked about looking for facts and all these things, you realize that when you talk about these things, you're talking about providing evidence, but providing nothing but rational argument.
Good.
This is the 2,000-year-old argument that philosophers, empiricists, and rationalists have. Anybody who's taken a philosophy class knows that. It was 2,000 years of argument because nothing of it was conclusive. There's no tie between evidence and rational argument. You need to provide evidence, empirical evidence, in order to support your argument when we're talking about empirical evidence.
I think you've just exposed your philosophy very beautifully. Let me ask you, do you believe that unless you can scientifically prove something, it's not true?
Well, science doesn't prove anything, so then you're going to have to rephrase your argument.
Do you believe that unless you can scientifically give evidence for something, that it's not true?
I believe that as a rational being, I would not be thinking in good faith if I accepted a belief or an argument that was not based on evidence that was established by science or any sort of observable, repeatable fact.
Good.
So
that's where you and I disagree.
Right.
I am convinced that you do not scientifically prove or give evidence to convince that George Washington was the first president of the United States. I am convinced that scientific knowledge is beautiful, good. But historical knowledge is also equally beautiful and good, but it has nothing to do with the repeatability that you were referring to earlier. You don't get George Washington back and have him inaugurated as first president of the United States.
If you're talking about history and about George Washington is the first president of the United States. So look at that from a scientific perspective. The reason that we can prove that as fact is because repeatable evidence, eyewitness accounts throughout the years of his terms of service. Like, there were hundreds of people that witnessed him being president. Hundreds of people all witnessing the same event.
Each individual
that's your
repeatable
repeatable evidence
is
right
a repeatable,
there.
observable
Every
piece of
single
evidence.
thing in history that we say happened historically, we look at and we go, that's why archaeology is such a big deal, because we go to all these different places, we dig these things up, and we look at them, we date them, we figure out where they came from. That's your repeatable evidence right there. There's as much science intertwined with history as there is with anything else.
Sir, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, Jesus Christ rose from the dead and appeared to over 500 people. Many eyewitnesses saw Christ risen from the dead.
How many people wrote the Bible? Who wrote the Old Testament?
Many people did.
But who? Names.
Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel,
Which
Daniel,
books?
Hosea, Joel, Amos.
There's no way to confirm for each individual book. Who wrote Genesis?
Probably Moses.
But you say probably. There's no way to go back and confirm this is the person that wrote it and check the credentials of who wrote it.
Oh, sure there is. And the evidence is Moses wrote the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy.
But in order to establish that, you need
And guess what? You do not have to read the Pentateuch in order to find out that Jesus really rose from the dead. In fact, the Pentateuch tells you nothing about the resurrection of Christ. Instead, if you want to find out about the resurrection of Christ, you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 1 Corinthians. Those are the 5 most important eyewitness accounts of the resurrection of Christ. 1 Corinthians 15, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John talk very clearly about how Christ died, he was buried, 3 days later he rose from the dead. And over a period of 40 days, he appeared to over 500 people risen from the dead.
But that's only one primary source.
No, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John,
But
Paul.
you just said
That's
that it was
5
all
right there.
written together. Yeah.
Pardon?
You just said that was all written together.
All written together?
Yeah. By the same group of people.
No, those are different people.
Yeah, but
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul are 5 different people.
Is there other evidence that isn't in the Bible, that isn't corroborated, like he said, from the 5 people that wrote those stories in the Bible, that says yes? Like, what about these 500 people? Where are these 500 people?
they don't have their own individual 500 accounts. They are anecdotal. They're secondary sources provided by a primary writer. They are just anecdotal evidence. They're actually not reliable as a historian. You can't corroborate people who just are said to have existed. If we had Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, and 500 other satellite books written in Judea at the time, that all of these people corroborating, yes, Jesus Christ appeared to me and 499 other people, then you start having a cohesive photograph of what's happening in the picture. But we have just 5 sources claiming the same thing. That's just 5 things. On the case of George Washington, we have an entire nation that can corroborate. We have so much history written by so many different people who knew and were there and fought under him and worked with him. All of these different sources corroborate to paint a photograph that he existed. His inauguration was real, and it did happen. I mean, in the case of Jesus' existence, there's, like I brought up the other day, the Romans wrote about him. They knew that he existed, but they don't corroborate any of the myths about him, about his rising from the dead, about any of his miracles. They cared nothing for it and heard nothing of it. They knew only that he existed and that he was a major political force in Judea in terms of spreading Christian ideology. That's all that mattered to them. So we can't corroborate that Jesus Christ existed. We cannot, in good faith, corroborate any evidence that Jesus Christ, any of his fantastic claims about him were real or in any sense believable.
Picking that up, finally.
Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote about Christ. Suetonius and Tacitus, 2 Roman historians, wrote about Christ. The enemies of Christ wrote about him in the Mishnah, which is the Jewish commentary on the Torah. They wrote he was a false prophet who performed miracles, but he was in touch with the wrong side. Very hostile references to Jesus in the Mishnah. There's absolutely no question that it's historically verifiable that Jesus Christ lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead.
Wrong. That's not corrupt. That's not evidence.
Thanks for sharing your opinion.
I mean,
That's
first
your
3
opinion.
are right. The first 3 are absolutely true. The 4th one is absolutely a leap of faith that is not based in any sort of evidence, historical or otherwise.
Yes,
There
it
is
is.
no evidence that he rose from the dead.
Sure it
You
is.
have
The
to go there
historical
and see for
record
yourself
points
and
out
take
that the
photographs.
apostles saw Christ. Thomas was not there. The apostle said to Thomas, "Hey, Jesus is risen from the dead." Thomas said, "No way. I'm not going to believe it unless I can see with my own eyes, unless I can take my hands and put the nail prints in his hands." One night all the apostles were together, including Thomas. Jesus stood among them, and he walked right up to Thomas and said, "My man, right here. Take your hands and put the nail prints in my hands. Take your hand and thrust it in the spear wound in my side." And Thomas stopped doubting and believed. And Thomas hit the floor and said, "My Lord and my God." Now, what's really important is those eyewitnesses died for what they claimed not to believe. They died for what they claimed to have seen. Matthew, John, Mark, Peter, Paul, all died as a result of Roman soldiers saying, "Acknowledge Caesar as Lord." It's the way we're unifying the Roman Empire. Or else don't acknowledge he's Lord, and we'll kill you. And every single one of them said, "We have seen Jesus Christ risen from the dead." And they died, not for a belief, not for a faith. They died for what they claimed to have seen. Study psychology. You cannot get people to die to cover up what they know to be a lie. Will people die for a lie? Of course they will. But they'll die convinced the lie is true. You're not going to sacrifice your life to cover up what you know to be a lie. Those first century followers of Christ said, "We saw Christ risen from the dead," and they died. Not for a belief, not for a religion. They died for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen. powerful evidence that Christ really did rise from the dead.
That's not evidence, though. You have to understand that it's convenient that these people who wrote the book are claiming those things. There is nobody else claiming those things. That's my overarching argument. You can't corroborate what they said, because whether or not they believed it, whether or not they were just political activists, whether or not they were just rebels, it doesn't matter. What they wrote in the book it was goal oriented. They were trying to spread an ideology. You can't use their own account for something that they were trying to accomplish as evidence for what they said. You need to corroborate it with outside evidence, and there's nothing of that exists. Nothing in the world corroborates what they said.
Really?
It's all internal. It's not surprising that 12 of these very important people that followed Jesus around for years got together and created these stories and then wrote them down in their own books, because these guys corroborated. It's not surprising.
Really?
That they weren't.
Then that means they knew they lied. And then the problem is you've got them dying to cover up what they knew to be a lie, because as you pointed out, they just made it all up. The problem, you see, you're not thinking clearly. If I make up a lie, sure, I'll pawn the lie off as the truth. But if I'm going to be threatened with death to maintain that this lie is true, just study Watergate, sir. 3 brilliant American lawyers, Dean, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman, were not willing to go to prison to cover up what they knew to be a lie, the Watergate scandal. How much more unlikely that a group of first-century Jewish Palestinian peasants are willing to die to cover up what they know to be a lie, because as you said, they all wrote it just out of their imaginations.
No, I mean,
that's amazing that you can believe that. I can't have that much blind faith as you are able to.
I mean, you know what a cult of personality is, right? When these people follow a man for years and repeat the same things over and over to thousands of people on their travels, you wonder if they start to believe the things they repeat. You say the same things over and over, you start to believe it.
All right.
People around you start to believe it.
You're right. Possibly that's a possible scenario. You know why it's wrong?
Why?
Because when you read what the Apostle Peter did, the bravest, most brainwashed guy I would think you would point to, he denied knowing Christ 3 times before Christ was executed. What did all the disciples do in the Garden of Gethsemane when Christ was arrested? Were they brainwashed followers? No. They all deserted Christ. They hightailed it out of there. What about Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 closest believers in Jesus? What did he do? He betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver. You see, sir, all these scenarios you're painting have some plausibility, but if you think carefully through them, they are ridiculous. Peter was not a hoodwinked, brainwashed guy. He denied knowing Christ 3 times. But after the resurrection, when he saw Christ risen from the dead, he went, whoa!
How can we be sure? Like, how can you justify using it as historical evidence when there's so much other stuff in here that by virtue of it being connected to this, like, lowers the percentage of possibility that this is in fact historically true, or at least is not exaggerated?
You bet. It's very simple. In order to get a diploma from Texas State University, you have to learn to distinguish scientific literature, mathematical formulas, psychology, history, literature, poetry as unique, different literary styles or genres. If you take a biology test the same way you take a test in poetry, you will flunk out of this place. So you have to learn how to distinguish between different literary styles. Otherwise, you will flunk. When you go to the Bible, you've got different literary styles. You've got Psalms, Book of Psalms. Psalms are all poetry. You've got the Gospels, which include parable, hyperbole, allegory, and historical narrative. If anybody ever writes a history on me, they're going to record some of the stories I told, which are not true. They are symbolic stories, analogy, allegory, metaphor. As a thinking person, you have to allow an author or a speaker to use symbolism in the form of analogy, parable, simile, metaphor to make their point. If you're so wooden in your thinking that you say, I'm sorry, I just have to have the history of this guy, I can't have anything that he said symbolically, That's sad. That's intellectual dishonesty. So, read the Quran, read the Bible, intellectual honesty, which means you pick up their different literary styles, historical narrative, poetry, apocalyptic literature, parable, simile, metaphor. That exists. That's the way you have to read any book, not just the Bible. It's the way you have to read any book.